The alley smelled of rain-soaked garbage and despair, a scent Lena knew as well as her own name. It was the shortcut she took home from the diner, a narrow passage between brick walls that seemed to sweat with the city's grime. Her white dress, a cheap cotton thing, was already wilting under the humid afternoon air, the long red apron tied around her waist a splash of defiant color against the grayness of her world. Her feet ached in worn-out shoes, and the meager tips in her pocket felt more like an insult than a wage. It was then that she saw it. Tucked beside a rusted dumpster, almost invisible in the shadows, was a briefcase. It wasn't just any briefcase. It was black leather, sleek and expensive, with polished silver clasps that gleamed even in the dim light. It looked alien in this place, like a diamond dropped in a puddle of mud. Her first instinct was fear. Things like this didn't just appear. They were lost by dangerous people, or they were a trap. But a stronger feeling pushed the fear aside. Curiosity. She glanced up and down the alley. Empty. With a trembling hand, she reached for it. The leather was smooth and cool, the weight of it substantial. She fought the urge to open it, a primal, desperate curiosity that screamed of lottery tickets and stacks of cash that could change everything. But her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, a tired but firm whisper from years ago. Honesty is the only thing we own that no one can take from us. With a sigh that carried the weight of her 21 years, Lena clutched the briefcase to her chest and walked out of the alley, back onto the bustling street, her brief detour from reality over. She didn't know what to do. The police? They wouldn't care. They'd probably take whatever was inside for themselves. Before she could decide, a long black car slid to the curb beside her, silent as a shark. Two men in sharp, dark suits got out. They didn't run. They simply moved with an unnerving purpose that froze her to the spot. The briefcase, the taller one said, his voice flat, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs. She held it out, her hands shaking so badly she was afraid she would drop it. They didn't take it. Instead, the man nodded toward the open car door. Mr. Ishikawa, we'll see you now. There was no room for argument in his tone. It was a statement of fact, an alteration of her fate delivered as casually as a weather report. Stepping into that car felt like stepping into another world, one of silent leather seats and the low hum of an engine that whispered of power. They drove through the city, leaving her world of peeling paint and broken pavement behind for a skyline of glass and steel. She watched her reflection in the tinted window, a scared girl in a waitress uniform, clutching a rich man's problems to her chest. The car purred into an underground garage, and she was led through a private elevator that ascended without a sound, the numbers climbing at a dizzying speed. The doors opened directly into an office that seemed to hang in the clouds. 3 of the 4 walls were pure glass, offering a panoramic view of the city she had only ever seen from the ground. The floor was polished black marble, the furniture sparse and elegant. Behind a massive obsidian desk sat a man, his silhouette framed by the sprawling metropolis. He didn't look up as they entered. He was focused on a single, perfect white orchid sitting on the corner of his desk. The men who brought her bowed slightly. Sir. The girl, they placed the briefcase on the desk and then retreated, melting back into the elevator as silently as they had appeared, leaving her alone with him. The silence was immense, heavy. Lena could hear her own frantic heartbeat. Finally, he lifted his head, and his eyes met hers. They were dark, piercing, and held a stillness that was more intimidating than any overt threat. This was Run Ishikawa, a name whispered in the darkest corners of the city, a powerful Japanese mafia boss. He looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her worn-out dress, her cheap shoes, her frayed apron. He saw everything in a single, dismissive glance. "You found this," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was low, smooth, with an accent that was subtle but sharp, like the edge of a blade. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her own voice sounding thin and reedy. In the alley behind the diner on West Street, he gestured to the briefcase. "Did you open it?" The question hung in the air, a test. He already knew the answer. She could see it in his eyes. He wasn't asking for information. He was judging her character. "No, sir," Lena said, lifting her chin just a fraction. "It wasn't mine to open, a flicker of something surprise?" Interest crossed his features before being suppressed. He leaned forward, his fingers tracing the silver clasps. With 2 sharp clicks, he opened it. He didn't look inside, not yet. His eyes were still locked on hers. "You work at the diner," he stated. "You walk through that alley every day. You don't make much money. A briefcase like this could hold a fortune. Enough to change your life. Why bring it back?" The question was a scalpel trying to cut through her to find the lie, the angle. He lived in a world of angles, of debts and leverage. A simple act of honesty was a language he didn't speak. "Because it wasn't mine," she repeated, her voice a little stronger this time. "My grandmother taught me that your name is all you really have. I wouldn't want mine to be thief." He held her gaze for a long moment, then finally looked down into the open case. Lena couldn't see the contents from where she stood, but she saw the effect they had on him. The iron mask of his control cracked just for a second. His shoulders, which had been perfectly straight, slumped by a millimeter. His hand, which had been steady, clenched into a fist on the desk. Whatever was in that briefcase was not money. It was not business. It was something personal, something that could wound a man who seemed untouchable. He closed the lid with a soft, final click, the sound echoing in the silent room. When he looked up again, his expression was unreadable, the mask back in place, but the air had changed. The cold, professional distance was gone, replaced by something more complex, more dangerous. He saw her now, not as a piece of the city's scenery, but as a variable, an anomaly. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice softer than before. "Lena," she replied. "Lena Washington." He repeated her name under his breath, as if testing the weight of it. "Lena Washington," he said again, louder this time. "You had access to something. Private. You saw where it was found. You were brought here. You have seen my face." Each sentence was a stone being laid, building a wall around her. She understood, with a chilling certainty, that this was not over. She couldn't just walk away. People who saw the face of the infamous Mafia boss, especially in a moment of perceived weakness, did not simply return to their lives of serving coffee and clearing tables. He stood up, a tall, imposing figure in a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than she made in a year. He walked around the desk and stopped a few feet from her. The sheer force of his presence was overwhelming. "You have proven yourself to be honest," he said, his voice a low murmur. "And foolish. The two often go together." He paused, studying her face, as if searching for a crack, a sign of the fear she was so desperately trying to hide. "Honesty is a rare commodity in my world. So rare, I'm not sure what to do with it when I see it." He turned and walked to the window, looking out over the city that was his kingdom. "I cannot let you go," he said, his back to her. "You are now a loose end. And I do not leave loose ends." Lena's blood ran cold. This was it. This was how her story ended, because of one moment of stupid, principled honesty. "However," he continued, turning back to face her, "killing you would be a waste." The word hung in the air, clinical and terrifying. He said it as if he were discussing a business asset, not a human life. An honest person is a tool. If used correctly. He walked back to his desk and leaned against it, crossing his arms. The powerful Japanese mafia boss was making a calculation, weighing her life on a scale she couldn't see. "You will no longer work at the diner," he announced. "You will work for me. Here. In this building. You will live here. I will provide you with everything you need: clothing, food, a place to sleep. In return, you will be my assistant. You will handle my personal effects. Things that require discretion." It wasn't an offer. It was a sentence. He was pulling her out of her life and imprisoning her in his. A gilded cage, perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. She wouldn't have to worry about rent or finding enough tips for dinner, but she would lose her freedom. She would belong to him. "Do I have a choice?" she asked, the words barely a whisper. A cold, humorless smile touched his lips. "The choice was made when you picked up the briefcase. You chose to be honest. This is the consequence." He saw the terror in her eyes, the fight-or-flight instinct warring with her resignation.
He seemed almost intrigued by it.
"Your life of poverty is over, Lena Washington. Your life of freedom is, too. You start now." He pressed a button on his desk intercom. "Kazu, prepare the guest suite on my floor. And bring Ms. Washington something to wear." Something other than that. He gestured dismissively at her uniform. A moment later, one of the men who had brought her entered, bowing his head. He looked at Lena, then at his boss, his face a professional blank. He was to be her warden. Lena stood frozen, the reality of her new life crashing down on her. Just an hour ago, her biggest problem was a rude customer who didn't tip. Now, she was the property of one of the most dangerous men in the city. The henchman, Kazu, bowed again and gestured for her to follow. As she walked past Ren's desk, her eyes fell on the briefcase one last time. It sat there, a black leather box holding a secret she didn't know, a secret that had inexplicably saved her life only to end it in the same breath. The suite was larger than her entire apartment building. It was a world of muted colors, soft fabrics, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto the glittering night. A closet bigger than her bedroom was already filled with clothes in her size, dresses, slacks, sweaters, all of them elegant and expensive. It was a beautiful prison, designed to make her forget the bars. For the first few weeks, Lena moved through the penthouse like a ghost. Her duties were simple, almost absurdly so. She organized Ren's personal study, she brought him his tea in the morning, and she took his suits to the in-house laundry. She rarely spoke to him, and he rarely spoke to her. She was a presence, a quiet, observant shadow in the corners of his life. She learned his routines. He rose before the sun, worked with a relentless intensity, and often stood for hours at the window, watching the city below as if it were a map of his own soul. He was a man surrounded by power, by wealth, by men who feared him, but he was utterly alone. She saw the way his subordinates flinched when he spoke, the way they never met his eyes. They saw the Mafia boss, the predator. But Lena had seen something else in that brief moment in his office. She had seen a crack in the armor. He watched her, too. When he thought she wasn't looking, she would catch his gaze on her as she dusted a bookshelf or poured his tea. He wasn't looking at her with desire, not then. It was with a kind of baffled curiosity. He was studying her, trying to understand the strange creature he had brought into his sterile, violent world. She never complained. She never cried, at least not where anyone could see. She simply did her work with a quiet dignity that seemed to infuriate and fascinate him in equal measure. She was honest, she was diligent, and she asked for nothing. In a life built on transactions, she was a gift he hadn't known how to ask for and now didn't know what to do with. He was testing her, she realized, leaving small amounts of cash on his dresser or a valuable watch on his nightstand. She never touched them. She would clean around them, leaving them exactly as they were, silent testaments to the principle that had landed her here. She was proving, day by day, that her honesty in the alley was not a fluke. It was the very core of who she was. What do you think is in that briefcase? Is it just letters or something more? Let me know what you think in the comments, and we'll get back to the story of Lena and the dangerous man who now owned her life. The first real crack in the silence between them came a month into her servitude. One of Ren's captains, a burly, arrogant man named Tanaka, cornered her in the hallway as she was carrying a tray. He had been watching her for weeks with a possessive sneer, seeing her as a new acquisition of his boss, another beautiful object to be admired and, perhaps, used. The boss's new pet, he said, his voice a low growl. He blocked her path, his physical presence a wall of intimidation. "You are very beautiful." Too delicate for this place, Lena tried to step around him, her heart pounding. "Excuse me, I have work to do," Tanaka laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "The only work you need to do is keep the boss happy." And maybe some of his friends. He reached out, his hand closing around her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. "I can show you how things work here." A cold, calm voice cut through the air from the end of the hall.
Tanaka.
"Take your hand off her," it was Ren. He stood there, perfectly still, but radiating a level of menace that made the air grow cold. Tanaka snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned, his face paling. He bowed low, his arrogance vanishing in an instant. "Boss." "I was just." Welcoming the new girl, Ren walked toward them, his steps silent on the marble floor. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet fury in his eyes was more terrifying than any shout. "She's not the new girl," Ren said, his voice dangerously soft. He stopped in front of Tanaka, who was still bowing, afraid to look up. "She is Ms. Washington." She is part of my personal staff. You will not speak to her. You will not look at her. You will not breathe in her direction. Do you understand? Yes, boss. I understand. My apologies. Tanaka stammered. Rin glanced at the red marks Tanaka's fingers had left on Lena's arm.
His jaw tightened.
Get out of my sight, he commanded. Tanaka practically scrambled away, disappearing down the hall. Ron turned his attention to Lena. He looked at her arm, then at her face. She was shaken, but her eyes met his, clear and steady. Are you all right? He asked, the question sounding stiff and used. I'm fine, she said, her voice trembling only slightly. He reached out, as if to touch her arm, but then stopped himself, letting his hand fall back to his side. He will not bother you again, he promised. It was the first time he had ever offered her a promise, the first time he had acted as her protector. He was a Japanese mafia boss, a man who dealt in violence and fear, yet he had used that same terrifying power to shield her. In that moment, something shifted between them. He was still her captor, she was still his prisoner, but the lines had blurred. He had defended her, not as an object, but as a person. Weeks turned into months. The autumn chill gave way to the first snows of winter. Lena found a strange rhythm in her new life. The fear had subsided, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. She learned the landscape of Ren's moods, the subtle tells that betrayed the emotions he kept so fiercely guarded. She knew the tension in his jaw meant a rival was causing trouble, and the way he stared out the window for hours meant he was wrestling with a memory. One night, she found him in his study long after the rest of the building had gone to sleep. The door was ajar, and a soft light spilled into the hall. She hesitated, but a sense of duty, or perhaps something more, compelled her to check on him. He was sitting at his desk, the infamous briefcase open before him. This time, he wasn't looking at the city. He was looking at what was inside. Strewn across the polished wood were a dozen or so old, faded letters, their envelopes worn soft with time. He held one in his hand, his thumb stroking the delicate, feminine handwriting on the paper. He didn't seem to notice her at first. His focus was entirely on the letter, his expression unguarded, filled with a profound and aching sadness. It was the most human she had ever seen him. When he finally looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, he didn't slam the briefcase shut or bark at her to leave. He just watched her, his dark eyes filled with a weary vulnerability. You must have wondered, he said, his voice raspy with emotion. She stepped into the room, her presence quiet and unassuming. She nodded. I knew it wasn't money, he looked back down at the letters. They were from my mother, he said, the admission costing him more than any business deal. She wrote them to me when I was a boy, away at school. She died before I could come home. He traced the characters of her name. She was a gentle woman.
Kind.
Like you, he said the last two words so quietly, Lena wasn't sure if she was meant to hear them. She would have hated what I've become. Lena walked closer to the desk. She didn't offer empty platitudes or words of comfort. She knew he wouldn't want them. Instead, she just stood there, a silent witness to his grief. She would be proud that you keep her letters, she said softly. It means you haven't forgotten her. Or the man she wanted you to be. He looked up at her, his eyes searching hers, and for the first time, he let her see past the mafia boss, past the killer, to the lonely boy who missed his mother. She was an honest person, he whispered. She believed it was the most important thing. He looked at Lena, a dawning realization in his eyes. That's why I couldn't let you go. When you stood in this office, so terrified but so incorruptible, you reminded me of her. That night changed everything. The invisible wall between them began to crumble, brick by brick. They started talking not just about her duties, but about small things. She told him about her grandmother, about growing up poor but loved. He, in turn, shared slivers of his past, stories of a childhood that was a strange mix of privilege and brutal training for the life he was destined to lead. He was still a dangerous man, the powerful Japanese mafia boss, and she never forgot that. The city still trembled at his name. But in the quiet moments, in the sanctuary of his penthouse, he was just Ren. And she was just Lena. The dynamic of captor and captive was slowly, imperceptibly, transforming into something else. He started seeking her out, asking her opinion on things that had nothing to do with her work, the color of a new tie, the food for a formal dinner. He valued her simplicity, her lack of agenda. She was the only person in his life who wanted nothing from him. This fragile peace was shattered one rainy Tuesday. Ren was in a tense meeting with the heads of the other families, a summit to carve up territories and settle disputes. Lena was in the kitchen, preparing tea, when she heard a commotion from the elevator. Kazu, Ren's most trusted guard, burst in, his face grim, his hand pressed to a bleeding wound on his side. "They're here," he gasped, stumbling against the counter. The Bratva. It was a setup before Lena could even process his words. The sound of gunfire echoed from the lower levels. The building's security had been breached. Alarms began to blare, casting flashing red lights across the pristine kitchen. Kazu shoved a small, heavy pistol into her hand. Her eyes widened in shock. "The boss's orders," he grunted, leaning heavily against the wall. "If they get to this floor, you go to the panic room. The code is your birthday." He said it himself. The thought that he knew her birthday, that he had used it to secure his own last line of defense, sent a strange jolt through her. It was the most intimate confession he had ever made. "He's trapped downstairs," Kazu continued, his breath coming in ragged pants. "They want him dead. They'll come for you, too. They'll use you as leverage." Lena looked at the gun in her trembling hand, then at the hallway, where the sounds of fighting were growing louder. Her old life, the one where her biggest fear was an angry customer, felt a million miles away. She was in the heart of the storm now, and the only person who could protect her was trapped in the floors below, fighting for his life. The panic room was not an option. Not while he was down there. Lena looked at the gun, then at Kazu, who was fading fast. "Stay here," she told him, her voice surprisingly steady. "Barricade the door." She took a deep breath, the cold weight of the gun a terrifying reality in her palm. She wasn't a killer. She was a waitress. But the man who had shown her kindness, the man who kept his mother's letters and used her birthday as a secret code, was in trouble. She crept out of the kitchen, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The penthouse was eerily silent, the sounds of the battle raging far below. The assassins would be methodical. They would clear the building floor by floor until they reached the top. Until they reached him. Or her. She made her way to the main elevator, the one that required Ren's specific keycard. She remembered seeing him use it, the way he tapped it against the panel. But there was another way. A service elevator at the far end of the floor, one the attackers might overlook in their haste. As she moved through the darkened living room, she saw them. Two men, dressed in black tactical gear, stepping out of the stairwell door. They hadn't seen her yet. She ducked behind a large marble pillar, her breath catching in her throat. She could hear them speaking in Russian, their voices low and brutal. They were checking their weapons, preparing for the final assault on the penthouse. This was it. There was no escape. She thought of Ren, of the sadness in his eyes when he spoke of his mother. She thought of his quiet protection, his surprising vulnerability. He had taken her life, but in a strange way, he had also given her one. She would not let them use her to hurt him. She raised the gun, her hands shaking so violently she could barely aim. One of the men turned, his eyes scanning the room. He saw her. His face broke into a cruel smile as he raised his own weapon. A gunshot exploded in the enclosed space, deafeningly loud. But it wasn't his. The man crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading on his chest. The second man spun around, confused, just as another shot rang out. He fell beside his partner. Lena stared, wide-eyed. Azrin stepped out from the shadows of the hallway behind them, his own gun smoking in his hand. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, his suit torn, but he was alive. His eyes found hers, blazing with a fierce, protective fire. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his gaze fixed on her, checking her for injuries. He took the gun from her trembling hand, his fingers brushing against hers. "I told Kazu to get you to the panic room," he said, his voice a low, rough growl. "I don't follow orders well," she whispered, a shaky smile touching her lips. He stared at her for a long moment, the sounds of his men finishing the fight downstairs a distant echo. He saw not the terrified waitress he had taken from the street, but a woman of incredible courage who had been willing to stand her ground for him. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumb gently wiping away a tear she hadn't even realized had fallen. "Lena," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. It was the first time he had ever shown her such open tenderness. In the midst of death and violence, surrounded by the wreckage of his empire, he looked at her as if she were the only thing left in the world that was real and whole. In the aftermath, the penthouse was cleaned, the bodies were removed, and the illusion of calm was restored. But the silence that followed was different. It was no longer a silence of distance and observation. It was a silence of shared experience, of a bond forged in fire. The attack had been a betrayal, orchestrated by a rival he had underestimated. Ren had been ruthless in his retaliation, and the message sent to the underworld was clear and bloody. He was not to be challenged, and what was his was not to be touched. Lena was his. That night, he came to her suite. He didn't knock. He just entered, closing the door softly behind him. He had showered and changed, but the exhaustion was etched on his face, and a fresh bandage was stark against his dark hair. She was sitting by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. "They came for you because of me," she said, her voice heavy with guilt. "You were almost killed." He walked over to her and knelt down, so his eyes were level with hers. "They came for me," he corrected gently. "You were just the prize they thought they could claim." They were wrong. He took her hand, his palm warm and calloused against hers. "Today, you had a choice. You could have hidden. You could have saved yourself. But you stayed."
Why?
She looked at their joined hands, at the stark contrast between his skin and hers. "For the same reason I returned the briefcase," she said softly. "It was the right thing to do." You are not the man they think you are." A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "I am exactly the man they think I am, Lena. I am a killer. I am a monster. Do not fool yourself into thinking otherwise. Monsters don't keep their mother's letters," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "Monsters don't protect waitresses who get in their way. And they don't use their birthday for a panic room code." His thumb stroked the back of her hand. "You see things in me that I buried a long time ago." He stood up, pulling her gently to her feet. "This life, this world, it is no place for someone like you. I should have let you go that first day. Would you have?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a fierce, possessive tenderness. "No," he admitted, his voice rough. "I don't think I could have." And then he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of desperation, of confession. It was a kiss that sealed her fate more surely than any command he had ever given. It was the moment the Mafia boss admitted that his most valuable possession was not his empire, his money, or his power, but the honest heart of a girl from an alley. From that day on, she was no longer his assistant, no longer his prisoner. She was his partner, his anchor, his home. The briefcase remained in his study, but now, sometimes, he would leave it open, and they would sit together in the quiet hours of the night, reading the faded words of a mother who had believed in honesty above all else, a legacy that had, against all odds, found its way home.